After the war, the rifle began to evolve into a true work of art. Still not comparable to the guns made by the European masters for their wealthy patrons, but beautiful in their own right. According to Kindig, there was a reason for this. In quotes, when the Revolutionary War ended in 1783, there were possibly 10 or more times as many gunsmiths in Pennsylvania as there had been at its start less than 10 years ago. But once the fighting stopped, the demand for rifles was probably not a great deal greater than it had been before the war started. It was this abundance of gunsmiths after the Revolution that accounts for what I like to call the golden age of the Kentucky rifle. In the 25 or 30 years following the war, the most beautiful Kentuckys were made, whereas before the war, a gunsmith had only to produce guns that were accurate. In the highly competitive market after the war, he had to produce guns that were beautiful as well as accurate if he wanted to stay in business. End of quote. This is not to say that rifles became cheap. They did not. Depending on crop and cattle prices and his skill as a hunter or lack thereof, a rifle could cost a frontiersman up to a year's income. While this seems steep, a man was less concerned about the cost than we would expect. First of all, he knew that it would eventually pay for itself in the deerskins he would take with it. More importantly, a man bought a gun literally for life. The lives of himself and his family would depend on it, and he wanted the best, at least if he had any sense. He bought his gun from a man who had a reputation for good weapons, and he didn't quibble about a few extra pennies for the finer details. To put it into 21st century perspective, and I realize the analogy is a poor one, try going to a Cadillac dealer and telling him you want an Eldorado, but without AC and automatic transmission. It says the car doesn't need these frills to function. The rifle was the Cadillac of firearms. The musket was more along the lines of a Ford pickup. It seems obvious in this light that if a man wanted a no-frills gun at a minimum of cost, the musket would have been his choice. Apparently, at least for the Longhunter, this was very seldom so. Why this was the case is strictly a function of the rifles used at the time. Hunting deer, bear, elk, and buffalo, not primarily for food, though he certainly fed himself and his family from them as well, but for their hides. There are some who claim that the smoothbore is more advantageous than the rifle because it is more versatile as a survival weapon. You can use either ball or shot, or you can load it. You can use either ball or shot, and you can load it faster in a pinch. All true. But the Longhunter was not playing a survival game. He was hunting specific animals for their hides, which he intended to sell or trade for profit. The rifle's advantage in accurate placement of its one shot over long distances and its economy in the use of powder and lead obviously offset its higher price tag and its lack of versatility. A headshot preserves the hide, which is essentially currency. To this day, we refer to a dollar as a buck, and the ability to make headshots at long range was, in my opinion, the reason rifles were the weapon of choice for the Longhunter. As already mentioned, the advantage of long-range accuracy found favor with Indian hunters as well. While the bulk of this chapter is devoted to rifles made by gunsmiths who's made their living in Pennsylvania, Virginia, and in the Carolinas, I should point out that there were gunsmiths in all the colonies. The reason that the middle colony smiths were so important is that they were predominantly rifle makers. It seems to be a common assumption that all gunsmiths in the 18th century made rifles. I don't believe this is a valid assumption, particularly prior to the Revolution. Those who learned their rifle trade either in England or France or from an English or French trained master might very well be unfamiliar with rifling techniques. Rifles were not unknown in either country, but because of limited demand, they were rare. Rifles were simply not part of the English or French gun-making tradition. On the other hand, rifles have been part of the German tradition since they were invented in the early 1400s. In fact, by 1487, 200-meter rifle shooting matches were being held in, I'm not going to attempt to pronounce that, it's too German. I'll just say Germany. Note that this was 5 years before Columbus sailed. So the rifle has a history, long history. Though not a predominant factor in the industry, by the middle of the 18th century, the English were making some rifles. The English were making some rifles. One bit of information has come to my attention that I find fascinating. Among the supplies ordered for General Braddock's ill-fated expedition to Fort Duquesne were over 4,000 Dutch and English muskets. I need to say that again. Oh, okay. Of his supplies were over 4,000 English muskets. Almost as an afterthought, 12 rifled carbines were included. My guess is that these latter were brought along for hunters with the intent that they be used to supplement the Army's diet with game, because whoever placed the order evidently expected these guns to see a lot of use. The proportion of flints and balls ordered for the rifles was nearly 3 times the quantity per gun as that ordered for the muskets. I can think of no other reason for their being included. The quantity is insignificant for them to have a military application, unless they were intended to supplement the 4 wall guns, which I doubt. I suspect that by this time the English were beginning to appreciate the rifle's superiority as a hunting arm. At least some were beginning to appreciate the commercial opportunity its popularity in this country presented. By 1760, English rifle barrels were being exported to America, but I have no idea in what quantity. In any case, they would be stocked here and therefore be indistinguishable from any other American rifle with a German or locally produced barrel without careful examination. I know of no attempt on the part of any researcher to determine the country of origin of surviving rifle barrels, or even if such a study would be feasible. But to return to my original premise, rifles were not a significant part of the English gun-making tradition, and with exceptions noted, the overwhelming majority of American riflesmiths in the third quarter of the 18th century were either German or German-trained. Many, if not most of these, have connection with the Middle Colonies. While the American rifle-making trade is traditionally held to have been, for the most part, centered in south-central Pennsylvania, there was, as I have already mentioned, a good deal of rifle-making taking place in Virginia, particularly in the Shenandoah Valley. Rifles showing a predominantly German influence were also being made in the Carolinas. There are a number of reasons for this. First of all, there were Germans moving to Virginia and the Carolinas, both from Pennsylvania and from the German Palatinates, beginning around 1730. Both the Yadkin Valley in North Carolina and the northern Shenandoah Valley in Virginia were largely settled by German immigrants, and German was the primary language in both places until well into the 19th century. Bethbara, North Carolina, was settled by Moravians in 1753. Unlike the usual pattern of English settlement, where a town grew around a station serving a few scattered farms, Bethbara was settled by an entire community from Pennsylvania, who brought their artisans with them, including a gunstocker and a gunsmith. This practice of moving a community in toto was apparently not unusual for Germans at this time, for sociological reasons beyond the scope of this work, but it's something to remember when dealing with the evolution of one of their more significant contributions to the 18th century frontier. Naturally, those smiths who migrated would most likely be journeymen who did not already have established shops, and if they settled in an area without many artisans, they took whatever work they could handle. In fact, it was not unusual for a gunsmith, regardless of location, to engage in other trades as his skill allowed and demand required. Blacksmithing, whitesmithing, silversmithing, cutlery, bell making, and even clock making. Conversely, craftsmen in these and other trades would occasionally engage in the repair, stocking, and possibly even the making of firearms. I'm going to leave that right there. Love you. God bless.